One of the most important things in environmental science is population biology. How many of a given species are in a particular area has a great effect on how well that particular environment is doing. You will see that um, in this chapter there are an awful lot of mathematical formulas. I want to reassure you that I do not emphasize math in these entry-level courses. So I will not ask you as students in my course to complete these population math problems. But I do want you to be aware of the general concepts influencing populations, and that's done through understanding the vocabulary. So a population is the total number of all members of a single species living in a specific area at a specific time. So these are individuals that would have the potential for successful reproduction. You need to be members of the same species and you need to be in the same area at the same time. The rate is how fast can organisms reproduce themselves, the rate at which you can double your population, and how long that actually takes. And so you think about humans can have babies about once a year, maybe a little faster than that, as in terms of the time. And normally humans have a single offspring at a time. So the rate would be one individual per unit of time would be one per year. And we were able to plot that geometrically to get an idea of what would happen over a period of time if you had ideal conditions. If all of the requirements for that species were met, how fast would it happen? And it turns out that if you actually provide all of the needed food and other requirements for a species, that we can have doubling times. And so there was an illustration in your book about cockroaches, everybody's favorite bug, I'm sure. And that what we know about cockroaches is that they have the ability to reproduce themselves very, very quickly. And so here's an example of what would happen if a pair of cockroaches were able to produce 20 offspring or 10 offspring per adult in 3 months. And so in the first 3 months, we would see that they would be able to produce 20 offspring, 10 per each, the male and the female. And then in another 3 months, those 20 would be able to produce 200. And those 200 would be able to produce 2,000. And those 2,000 would be able to produce 20,000. And so one pair of cockroaches, a male and female, if they had all the resources that they needed to have in order to survive, would ultimately produce 20,000 offspring per year. And we can plot that, and you can see that that would go up very, very quickly. And so just within 1 year, we are on what is known as an exponential growth curve. One of the things that we know about populations is that populations cannot sustain that. There are not enough resources to keep doing that. And there are therefore what are known as limiting factors. And so what are the things that ultimately will limit how fast a population can replicate itself? And it usually has to do with food supply or the amount of territory that gets crowded out as a population grows. If the population is left unchecked, you would maybe see an idea like this with moose. If they had plenty of material and no predators, this would be kind of like the wolves in Yellowstone elk example, is that you could see that the wolves would replicate themselves on an exponential curve as long as the resources were there. And that if you chase this up to what their biological potential was, if there was more and more food available, this curve would continue to go up. But what we see is that there's going to be some kind of a limiting factor, that something's going to happen that will cause the moose to run out of food, and there will therefore be a dieback. Most environments, all environments, I should say, all environments have a designated carrying capacity. How many animals can successfully live on that particular area in order to be healthy and survive? And so the carrying capacity is defined by what are the limiting factors without being able to deplete all of the offshoot. Now, what you would see in this oscillation is that there would be a dieback, and the population of moose would greatly decrease for a couple of years. The environment would be able to recover. The moose then start to grow at an exponential rate, overuse their environment. And so you see this oscillation is kind of smoothing out ultimately toward the carrying capacity. Non-human organisms will find this carrying capacity, how many animals can actually survive on an area without overuse of the environment. So if we look, for example, at the wolves of Yellowstone, we see the introduction of 40 wolves that we looked at in that video, and that those wolves will reproduce themselves until they reach the carrying capacity, how much food is available for them. And once they reach this carrying capacity, their reproductive rate will actually decrease, and animals will begin to emigrate, move out of the area, and try to find new food sources. This is known as an S-shaped curve. This is a much more normal population growth curve. Sometimes it's called the logistic growth curve, but we often just refer to it as an S-shaped curve. So what are some of the limiting factors? The limiting factors can be just the amount of space that organisms have. We know that when they become more tightly packed, they are therefore physiologically stressed, and they are more prone to disease. It's an interesting concept in terms of the COVID virus that we're facing. Is the COVID virus some sort of a limiting factor to human populations? And then in other species would be, as you increase the numbers, the amount of organisms that are then taken by predators would go up, and so these would become limiting factors. This is an important comparison between our selected species. Our selected species are organisms that don't live very long. They have a large amount of offspring that they will develop, but very, very few of them will ultimately live to be adults to have their own offspring. So things like clams and fish, etc., have large numbers of offspring, but relatively few of them end up being making it to adulthood. You see also that they can use their niche as a generalist, and they are normally prey organisms that feed on a lower part of the trophic level. K species by comparison are long-lived. They reach maturity much later, so this would be things like elephants and wolves and human beings. And as such, they normally become predators. Elephants aren't predators, but they're wolves, and they therefore are feeding at a higher trophic level. So this right-hand group may only have offspring every 2 to 5 years. This R-related species on the left produce a tremendous amount of eggs every year. A clam can produce millions of eggs per year. Things that influence the population are going to be, what is the birth rate? How many births are you having in that population? How many people are actually moving in or out? How many organisms are moving in or out of the area? That's called immigration. What's the death rate or the mortality for the population, and what's the emigration, how many people are moving out of an area. So immigration versus emigration. And so in the United States, we've actually seen the birth rate go down over time. At one point in time, families were having 7, 8 children. Now it's 1 to 2 children as a normal rule. If the United States experienced a large amount of immigration, people moving into the area, for example, human beings, then the number of organisms, the number of human beings in the United States would go up. Our death rate has typically gone down in the United States, just applying this to human beings. And then until recently, relatively few people ever emigrated away from the United States. They stayed for economic opportunity. And we're also very interested in the lifespan of certain species. Bristlecone pines in the Mammoth area in the White Mountains, just east of the Mammoth. We know that through research can live thousands of years. Most humans don't live to be 120 years, but that seems to be kind of the upper limit of how long they can last. And this all relates itself to survivorship curves. And so if we look at survivorship curves, we have type 1 organisms. We have type 1 organisms shown here, like the elephant on the red line. And most of these organisms live a long life and then perish at the end of that life. You have type 2 organisms who seem to die at a pretty uniform rate regardless of their age. So this seagull example is that every year a certain number of seagulls are dying regardless of what their age happens to be. And then the type 3 individuals are going to have a high mortality as youth, and very few live to be adults to reproduce. And so these become all very important factors for us as we look at population dynamics. Some of these factors are intrinsic to the organism itself, their own basic biology. Other things are outside of their population, the environment that they live in, and those are known as extrinsic factors and biotic factors. What are the things that are in the environment? Living things are biotic factors, and non-living things are called abiotic factors. And all of these things would ultimately influence how much of the population is actually going to survive. Predator-prey relationships, what we would see here is that you see plotted the number of rabbits that were available, and then lagging behind that, as because this was a really high population of rabbits in this year, then offset by that, there was a higher reproduction in the lynx, the predators, and so the predator numbers went up. They decreased the population of food items, and therefore the lynx population decreased. So there's a relationship in the oscillations, the up and down of predators and prey, and the predators are lagging behind the prey, and we see this locally. When we have high rain years in San Diego, we get a great growth of plant material. Then we see rodents increase, and then the next year we see an increase in the sightings of things like rattlesnakes and other kind of predators that follow behind that. There's relationships inside of a species that's called intraspecies. So all humans are competing for resources. All snowshoe rabbits would be competing for the resources available. So that's called intraspecific interactions, and it has to do with space a lot. What resources are available? Diseases come into play. Another thing about populations is what happens when a few individuals land in a new area. Island biology is an incredibly interesting part of population biology. What happens when a few organisms land on an island that hasn't been inhabited before? with that kind of organism, and they are called the founders, the founder effect, and then the number of offspring from that. Or you could have some kind of a natural disaster that causes a population to separate, and only a few survive that, and that's called a bottleneck effect. So this is population biology in a nutshell. Don't worry about the math, but do worry about the vocabulary and the concepts.